Hello class, and welcome to the second week of Gender and Power. This is your first asynchronous course. I'm going to hopefully be uploading this to YouTube. Anyway, I'll send an email to the class letting them know how to access it, which obviously you have because you're watching this video clip. So a couple of housekeeping points that I wanted to make. In general, I'm going to ask that you do this asynchronous portion on Tuesday of our class during regular class time. I think it's good if we try to maintain a regular, 4:30 to 5:45 Tuesday, Thursday practice. And I will do my best, although I can't make any promises, to be free at that time on Tuesdays as well. So if you have questions while you're watching the lecture or whatnot, you can email me and I'll do my best if I'm free to answer your questions right away. And I think on Thursday we can talk more about your first written assignment that will be due. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to just need to pull up this PowerPoint or Google slide that I'm going to share with you all. Okay, so our first unit last week was about terms, right? We're trying to, or I was trying to show you the key terms that we're going to be talking about throughout this term, right? Throughout the semester, both in anthropology, but also those topical terms that we need to know around sex, gender, and sexuality. Okay, so this next unit, we're going to turn back the clock. We're looking at the origins of what's called an anthropology of women, or that moment when anthropologists had to face the question of gender bias in research. And as I'll talk about in a minute, that was very much connected to the second wave feminist movement. And hopefully after this lecture, you'll have a sense of why I call it here early interventions and questioning universals. I should also say here that, the readings for Tuesday and Thursday, frankly, I find to be a bit dry. So if you do as well, I'm sorry, but they're really, I think, probably the driest readings of the semester, and they're also some of the most important. That's why I assigned them. I think you really need to have an understanding of where the anthropology of gender came from to understand how different the sorts of questions that anthropologists working in gender and sexuality are today. So some of the things we'll be doing is I'm going to outline basic concerns or objectives in this field that was once called an anthropology of women, which we now talk about anthropology of gender. But the fact that it was an anthropology of women is important. It matters. We'll talk about why. I'm going to discuss how anthropology collided with or conversed with the second wave feminist movement. We're also going to talk about domestic versus public spheres, or what's also sometimes called the private versus the public spheres, and nature versus culture. These are important topics or issues that we can also talk about on Thursday live. And here's the wordy bit. The anthropology of women tries to understand the difference between universal explanations and culturally particular explorations of female subordination. So for those of you who are familiar with anthropology already, this might be a review, but for those of you who have never taken an anthro class before, it's important to know that cultural anthropology is really concerned with thinking about, on the one hand, what all humans share, those universals that make us human, and those particular elements of the human experience that we don't all share, that are specific to particular cultural contexts. So cultural anthropologists are always juggling between thinking about sameness and difference, between universality and particularity. And this comes up very clearly in the readings for this week in the anthropology of women, where anthropologists were trying to come to particular conclusions and also universal conclusions about the status of women across cultures. I have a YouTube video that I'd like you to watch. I'm going to put the link to this up in Scholar. If you don't find it, remind me, or hopefully maybe you can even access it here from this video. I'm not sure, but I'll have it up in Scholar nonetheless. So I'm going to ask you to actually pause this video and watch it, because I will ask questions and have activities throughout my lectures, even these asynchronous lectures. I'm going to ask you to pretend that you're really sitting in class, to actually do these reflections. Why is that? Because research shows that if students do, write, reflect while in the middle of lecture, you actually are more likely to retain the information. So anyway, I'm going to pause for a second. Please go and watch this first video. Okay, so hopefully by now you watched the video that I just mentioned. Answer these questions. So Ortner's article is, of course, the article that was due today. So pause, take as much time as you need, and answer these questions for me. All right, so that was just kind of it. I'm hoping that it was an interesting activity for you to think about, right, the timing of all of this and how sexist academia was, no matter what discipline, and continues to be, but certainly anthropology at that particular time, seen through Louise Lamfair's experience. So she was a professor at Brown University in the 1970s. And I want to note that Ortner's article, the article you read for today, was published in 1974. So part of what I find really interesting about all of this is at the same time that these female anthropologists are experiencing sexism in the academy, in their everyday lives, are participating in the second wave feminist movement, are speaking out, it's also clearly influencing their work. And that's why we have this field called the anthropology of women coming about at that time. Anyway, I'm going to turn us back even earlier than the 70s, just for a brief moment, and then we'll come back. I just wanted to say that the study of gender and sexuality in anthropology was not new to the 1970s. The idea, or especially the language of sex roles, was long present in anthropological research. And one area that it was present in was this field, the cultural and personality school. We have two anthropologists here, Margaret Mead on top, Ruth Benedict below, both students of Franz Boas. Perhaps some of you who are anthro majors recognize that name. Hopefully some of you do. If not, sidebar, we can talk about this Thursday if you're interested. But anyway, these two anthropologists, and I should say Franz Boas was actually really good about supporting female students, PhD students in anthropology, that is, that went on to have illustrious careers in anthropology. But the Culture and Personality School, which is a school of thought, not an actual school, right? It was a kind of theory, was that there's certain cultures celebrate particular human personalities, but also that these are organized by gender. So culture, in other words, determines the particularities of various sex roles. And one thing that this research did was open us up to two particular questions. How do gender roles work differently in different societies, right? So anthropologists are showing us that through, even back then in the 1920s and 30s, in some societies, it's not only accepted, but, it's not only happens, but it's also expected that men carry children. In other societies, if a man was to carry a child, it would be considered abnormal, inappropriate, right? Based on those gender norms. So anyway, showing that there's a diversity of this means that not every society thinks alike in terms of gender roles, but also how do different societies would deal with non-conforming genders and sexualities, right? And this is something that both of them wrote about, and Ruth Benedict in particular wrote about this in terms of Native American societies and shamans and the role of kind of non-gender conforming folks. Okay, so again, that was pretty radical for that time. So again, on the left, we have Margaret Mead, who of course did field work famously with Samoan adolescent girls. And she argued that at that time, young Samoan women actually had a much easier transition into adulthood because sexual mores and standards and propriety were not as heavy, as difficult. And so she basically argues that they had a healthier transition into adulthood, that adolescence wasn't a time of stress, anxiety, fighting with parents that we experience in the West. And on the right, you have a picture of Ruth Benedict. So now moving toward An Anthropology of Women, which was the title, as you can see, of one of the edited volumes at that time that came out. So we have in the 1970s a shift. Anthropologists now are directly engaging with questions of inequality and power. Think this is the time, this is post-civil rights era movement. So this is happening the same time that the Black Power movement is gaining momentum, that gay and lesbian rights movements are gaining momentum, and now also that the second wave feminist movement is gaining momentum. So again, anthropologists are experiencing these movements in their everyday lives, and they're also that is also coming to influence the kind of questions they ask and the kind of research that they do. So in 1974, you have Michelle Rosaldo, whose work we will read on Thursday. She's was an editor for Women, Culture, and Society, important book that came out. And around the same time, we had another book, Toward an Anthropology of Women, that came out. Both of these texts kind of addressed similar questions around the universal subordination of women. So again, the second wave feminist movement, of course, influenced all of academia, not just anthropology. And on the one hand, it very much did influence anthropology, influenced the profession. It influenced, and hopefully for the better, instances where folks like Louise Lamfair faced sexism within the discipline. But it also came to show not only the kinds of discrimination and harassment that exist in the field of anthropology, but how anthropological research has been biased, or at that time was biased, towards men's experiences. Okay, so now I'm going to cut the video and you will continue on part 2.